One thing I've discovered that when we come into this new revelation of grace, when we finally put both feet on the side of grace, there's usually a point in time, it could be a few weeks, it could be a few months, maybe even a couple of years, where we go through this crisis of grace. We go through this moment where we're trying to decide, am I going to accept the new covenant gospel of grace, or am I going to continue to wander and waver on two sides of the fence? And I think there's going to come a moment in your life, I know it did for me, where you're going to just have to decide, am I going to go all in with grace? Today I want to talk about this crisis of grace that I had, and I know some of you are having right now, so let's jump into it. Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Tony Sutherland here. Everything I do is all about pointing lives to Jesus and all things grace. So I started thinking about this crisis of grace this past week when I was, looking at some of the posts on Instagram, and one of the guys that I follow, Dr. Paul Ellis, who is a grace teacher and a magnificent teacher at that. Some of his posts are very revelatory and they really helped me think deeper about grace. He made this post about 2 or 3 days ago, and I just want to read it to you because it so describes how I felt for a while, and when I had my crisis of grace, this kind of explains a little bit about my dilemma. He says, 20 years ago today, on August 18th, 2002, I preached on the gift of righteousness that comes by faith. I said, there is nothing we can do to make ourselves righteous. And I listed some of the things that stop us from receiving Christ's righteousness. My message of free righteousness was so offensive that one lady got up to leave. I was a young pastor, and I would like to say I preached grace messages like that all the time. I didn't. The following week, I preached on the need to plant churches, and I buried my people under the weight of my ambition. This was me. Free grace one week, blood, sweat, and tears the next. But all that changed in 2007 when I crashed and burned. I was in a bad place for a long time, but in that dark time, God showed me things about His love and grace I had never seen before. He put a new song in my heart, and since then it's been grace, grace, and nothing but grace. Man, does this describe me? This is my story here. It was right around that same time, Dr. Paul, about 2006, 2007, where I went through one of the greatest crises of my life. In fact, you can watch a couple videos on it. You can go all the way back to the beginning of the YouTube channel, Grace is My Story, but you can also watch kind of an updated version of that called Garland of Grace. I filmed that right around Christmas time, and I kind of shared my story about what I was going through at that time. I won't take all this time here to go into that, but I walked through a season of tremendous mental anguish, panic attacks, anxiety, fear, condemnation, and it just seemed to come out of nowhere. And at that time, God began to reveal His grace to me. And I was having a crisis of grace. And I can't tell you how many preachers and pastors that I've talked to that have finally stepped over to the side of grace. They don't have their foot in law and foot in grace. They've come over completely to the side of grace. I've heard so many of those pastors tell me what a difficult season it was for them, not just in accepting it and having to deal with the ridicule and the unpopular gospel of grace, because it is unpopular. I have a powerful video on that called Unpopular Grace. And, many of these pastors, they were being literally cut off from friends and leaders. And at the same time, they were going through other major crises in their life. Family issues and financial issues and job issues and emotional turmoil. And I can't tell you the amount of times I've heard this same story. Man, Tony, I crashed and burned. I ran into a wall. And it's interesting. I felt that same way. I hit that wall. What is that wall? Well, Paul talks about it In Ephesians, he calls it the wall or the barrier of division. It says, for he himself is our peace, watch, who broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. What was that wall? In particular, in context here, it's talking about that he's joining the Jews and the Gentiles together by removing that wall. Now we're all free to access this grace through Jesus Christ, but that wall is also that thing that we hit going 100 miles an hour. I was going 100 miles an hour with the law, passionate and zealous about declaring that we should be obedient and walk in God's law and obey him and be passionate about, serving God. And, a lot of times when people talk about people being saved, they'll say, well, he's been serving the Lord for 20 years. Well, you see, that described me. For many, many years, 3 and 4 decades, I served the Lord, but I never really felt like a son. I felt more like a slave, an obligation to obey and to please God and to meet his expectations and to meet his standards. And so going so fast, I hit that wall. I had a crisis of grace. I had finally run out of all the steam and all the energy and all the self-passion that I had. I was a lot like Paul. Paul was zealous for the law. Paul was a Pharisee, and he was a strict Pharisee. And he lived according to the law, and he was on his way to Damascus in Acts chapter 9, on his way to carry out several death sentences of those who called themselves Christians, Christ followers, and Paul wasn't having it. It's either you walk after the law or you be accursed and stoned to death. And Paul was on his way to Damascus, and he had a major crisis of grace. He met the Lord face on his way to Damascus to do what he thought was right, that he was passionate and zealous about. He literally was terrorizing Christians. They were terrified of him. When they heard he was coming, they were terrified. But Paul was doing the zealous work of God, and he was on his way to Damascus. And Jesus blinds him with his light in the middle of the road. The Bible says Paul falls onto the ground as blind, as dead, and he hears the Lord Jesus say, why are you working against me? Why are you resisting me? Why are you warring against me? And Paul was having a crisis of grace right here. And he couldn't see for 3 days, and somehow the Lord led him to the house of Ananias. By the way, the name Ananias means grace. I find that so powerful that God led Paul to the house of grace, and Ananias lived on a street called Straight. You see, God in our crisis of grace will lead us to the place of grace and set our lives straight. Come on, that's so powerful. Hey guys, I want to take just a few minutes real quick to remind you and encourage you to get a copy of my book, Grace Works. I wrote this a few years ago, and this book talks about the journey that I made from here to happy. I know many of you are looking for a way to get from here to happy, and I believe that many things I say in this book will kind of push you and start you on that journey. I used to be a person that was always worried about how I was doing for God, living anxiously and fearfully and wondering and obsessing about my own progress. And then a few years ago, God began to pour out his revelation of grace in my life, and it literally revolutionized everything about me, including my ministry. And now I filter all my ministry, my teachings, my preaching, my songs, everything I do, I filter it through the gospel of the grace of Jesus Christ that is only found in Jesus Christ. Why do I call it Grace Works? Well, we're not saved by works. We're only saved by grace. Ephesians chapter 2 says that we are saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. So why do I call it Grace Works? Well, grace is what works. I believe that through the grace of Jesus Christ, you can live for God better on accident than you ever could on purpose. So I want to encourage you to get a copy of my book today. You can get it on Amazon. You can get a digital copy on Kindle, and you can get a copy on my website as well. So let's jump back into this awesome teaching of God's marvelous grace. You see, Paul went in one way and came out another, and Paul became the apostle of grace. That's where we get our understanding of the gospel of grace, is through Paul's writings. Paul would have never wrote that way before and talked about Jesus the way he talked about him, and talked about this free gift of righteousness, that it's not of works, lest any man should boast. Come before the throne of grace in time of need. And see, Paul understood that very well, because when you come before a throne, you've got to bow down. You got to humble yourself. You got to say, I need God's grace. It's not just coming in hard times and difficult circumstances, which we all need grace for, but more importantly, it's coming to terms with surrender to the gospel of grace, that it's not me and Jesus, it's Jesus alone. I don't help God with my good behavior and my moral living. I need grace every single moment of my life. I've got to humble myself. And there was a time when I resisted it. When someone would show me something about grace or talk to me about the eternal salvation and forgiveness that we have, I would resist it. I was like, no, that is not God. That is not New Testament. But now I've come to a much deeper revelation of what the grace of God actually is. And it has caused me to be so much more passionate, so much more joyful, so much more relaxed and at ease in my relationship with God. I don't carry condemnation anymore. I don't carry self-guilt and second guessing my salvation. I am at rest. No, I'm not being arrogant. I need God's grace every day. I'm so thankful that in the midst of my struggles, and even mental and emotional and behavioral bad patterns sometimes, I have the forgiveness of God eternally. I can rest in my salvation. I've finally decided that I'm going to enter rest and put down my sword and my shield and my weapons and stop fighting and resisting God's grace. I'm talking about a crisis of grace today. And some of you who are listening right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're in this crisis of grace. You feel your mind being attacked, your emotions are being stressed, your circumstances around you, it feels like a hurricane, a whirlwind of attack on your life. The enemy is trying to put a thorn in your brain. Paul said, because of the revelations of grace that I was receiving, a thorn was sent into my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Paul was in the crisis of his life, but God's grace was sufficient to remove that thorn and cause Paul to be able to come into the freedom. You know, whatever the enemy is throwing at you right now in your crisis of grace, I'm telling you, grace will get you through and get you over. It did for me. And I want to encourage you, not everybody just slides into grace, because there is a resistance from the enemy. You know, you can go on and preach the law and live by the law and work by the law and try to please God and try to live according to that old covenant standard, and the enemy will let you go on your way and do that. But when you start to come into the contemplation of coming all the way over into the side of grace, you're going to go through a crisis of grace. Some of you know what I'm talking about, and some of you have thought about going into all grace, but the reason you haven't is because you're afraid of what others will think. It's unpopular. You'll get resistance. People won't agree with you. You may lose people. You may lose people in your church. You may lose people in your ministry. You may not get invited to come back and speak. I know that happened to me several times in my evangelistic ministry. Churches just wouldn't have me back. They wouldn't have it. You know, people would be responding, and, you know, you could see freedom coming on people's lives, but pastors and leaders, they were very resistant to it because they preached a mixed message. They preached law and grace. We're only saved by grace. And listen, if you're contemplating coming into grace, all grace, you're going to have some resistance, but I want to encourage you, make the journey. It's worth it. It's worth the battle. It's worth the fight. It's worth the loss. Paul said, I've counted all things as lost to know Jesus, to live under the revelation of the gospel of grace. And I'm encouraging you right now, keep making that journey. Don't fall back. Friends, I've decided to follow Jesus. Not Jesus and Moses, not Jesus and Elijah, not Jesus and the 10 Commandments. You can't live after Moses and Jesus. You can't follow Elijah and follow Jesus. You got to come out of the wilderness and go through your personal crisis of grace. But once you come through it, life will never be the same again. So what's it going to be for you? Can you endure this season of crisis? Can you endure this crisis of grace? I believe you can. If you'll hold on, stand firm, let people go by the wayside, push through the emotional struggle, God will completely turn things around. And once you come through it, the enemy, though he tried to keep you away from it, tried to resist you, tried to push you in another direction, attacked your mind, attacked your emotions, used other people to slander you and cut you off, whatever the devil does, it will only prove to be for your good. If you can endure this crisis of grace, you'll come through, because at every crisis, there is a cross. Hey guys, thanks so much for taking time to watch this video. I truly hope it encouraged you, and if it did, I want to remind you to subscribe to the channel, hit those bell notifications so you'll know when new content is coming out. Like this video and share it as well. You know some people need some help to get through their crisis of grace just like you. I'll be back again real soon with another encouraging teaching, something to give you a grace lift, something that'll help you get through your crisis of grace, something that'll point you a little more toward Jesus. And until then, we'll see you.